The next question is actually also from the Stanford group. They say, Mr. LaRouche, you addressed this somewhat in your presentation today, but we have had an ongoing controversy in our discussions here on the issue of the SDI. Some among us have argued that the SDI, at least as it was adopted by Ronald Reagan, was principally a military policy. But some of us who have looked at this thing for quite some time have taken a different approach. And it is our contention that the SDI has to be looked at essentially as an extension of the space program, but one which has the potential to be a science-driven effort that would increase the quality of life not only for Americans, but for mankind as a whole. It's our view as a group that for the most part, especially since the Second World War, that most of the wars that we have fought have largely been wasteful and have not been wars fought for any particular principle, and that therefore it would be a denigration of the ideas implicit in the SDI to consider them as merely a military effort. Could you expand on this a bit and share with us your view and what you were thinking when you first designed the concept?
Well, this goes back to my childhood. You know, people make mistakes. They think of the world as sort of granulated, as what little particles hitting against each other with sort of a stochastic effect. It's not like that at all. When I think of, for example, if I look at the genealogy of my own family and look at what my mind is shaped to become as a result of the colonization of the United States and Canada. My first ancestors in this country came here in the first half of the 17th century, in Quebec and also in Massachusetts at about the same time. One of the ancestors of note came over in the Mayflower. Others came over in Massachusetts that period. And then, so that when you, and then I look back at, you know, it was my age. My grandparents were born at the beginning of the 1860s. That's a little bit more than 100 years, isn't it? And their ancestors were born, again, 60, 70 years earlier. One part of my family were Quakers, but there was a group of Quakers which were called the Free Quakers, such as James Fenimore Cooper. And his father was a general officer of some rank in the Continental Forces, the American forces. He became the head of the U.S. Intelligence Service abroad at the U.S. branch, James Fenimore Cooper, and was, of course, a naval specialist who he founded the conception of naval warfare as a conception of political conception, and was together with a whole group of people in the 19th century, intermingled with people in France of the Carnot circles, that thing, in Germany and so forth. So when I look at my family background, you've got a very clear picture of what the environment was which shaped what became me. It's rather awesome. So you realize that you are not a product of something that was born physically, like some ape that chose to get smart, or something like that. But you are a product, a conscious product of all kinds of ingredients, especially intellectual and cultural ingredients, which went into the formation of your personality, the development of your personality. And what's one of the most important things about this is that when you choose a profession, or choose a commitment which has the effect of a profession, You reach out to those things in your environment, your social, cultural environment, which fits something within this evolution of the United States. And so it not only does the environment influence you, but you influence the environment by the way you trace your intellectual ancestry as well as your biological ancestry. And you treat your biological ancestry as an accident, which happened to your cultural ancestry. And that's the way we have to look at these things. So then in the case of the SDI, this is me. I, at the age of 14 to 15, did not accept Euclidean geometry. I just didn't accept it. And I had a good reason not to accept it, because I observed some construction. I said, if this thing is right, then the construction is going to occur. And it proved that you could not have a positivist conception of mathematical geometry. You had to have a physical conception of geometry. So that changed my whole choice of things, because I made it a fighting issue. So I fought, in my whole educational experience and youth experience, I fought for this approach as opposed to the general so-called Euclidean approach in everything. And that defines the way you work. So therefore, what happened with the creation of the SDI was my conception. I made choices, and I reached out in the culture, among certain professionals and others, in the United States, in various parts of Europe, in other parts of the world. And I became a catalyst to pull together people who represented these traditions in the leading military circles of France, the circles around what had been Charles de Gaulle, leading military circles in Germany, and scientific circles in Germany, which also agreed. Leading military circles in Italy who agreed. Some Soviet circles who agreed also with those things. So what happened is, because I sparked this thing, all these things began to come together through people who identified in themselves knowledge and attitudes which corresponded to this kind of experience. And then when I began to spread this thing, I had people from the former OSS, of the faction which I was sympathetic to, as against the British faction, who came to me and said, hey, we got to work together. So in that sense, what happened was a leading circle, intellectual circle, of the U.S. political intelligentsia, military and so forth, came together around me in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, around this conception of how we could get out of this military bind, called this European, Anglo-American, Soviet conflict. How to get out of this thing. And you can only go at it by going at it directly. You have to say, okay, here's the kind of skills you represent. Here's the way these skills should be used. To what purpose and to what effect? Now, if you want to take the case of a guy who was recruited to this process, which I was involved in, Edward Teller. Edward Teller, at a meeting with the Soviet representatives, which occurred in Sicily, in Erice, defined the purpose of the SDI as the common aims of mankind. Now, if you know anything about Edward Teller and what his reputation is in his role inside the United States over that period, you understand what that means. It was the people in the intelligence community. What was my project? My project was headed under my plan for a U.S. intelligence university. I said, the United States, the universities are no longer reliable. And especially for intelligence purposes, all we have this British influence is coming into our universities. We no longer have American historians. We have, imitation American, British-trained creatures, different species, like baboons from South Africa or something, carrying baobab nuts back and forth. And the people were not historians. They were chroniclers. They would chronicle events and try to make an algebraic positivist interpretation of a chronicle of a series of events, like a mathematical formula. Their standard was that, and they would ignore most everything of importance that they didn't like. It was fake. So I said, we in the United States have a problem. The problem is we used to have historians, we used to have scientists, we had a list of names I could name, and we don't have that anymore. We need an American university which is dedicated to training historians, intelligence officers, and so forth, which has the competence to define an American interest view through these professions, which were concentrated upon our academic training program of this type. So I wanted another thing to succeed West Point and so forth, which would be the intelligence education, which would produce historians and people with various skills, including a resource from which to recruit intelligence officers who go through this thing with the language skills and so forth that are necessary for an intelligence officer. So I had this plan for an intelligence university. At that point, in this process, the head of the CIA, newly in there, who was a friend of an old friend of mine, we began to run this operation. And it was in that context of that operation as an applied concern of to make a change in U.S. policy from the policy that was a trend portraying this policy to an institution which would actually represent what we as a people culturally represent as distinct from Europe. An American intellectual institution, which we were losing. And so out of this, what was assembled in this process was throughout the U.S. intelligence community, or certain elements of it, there was a consolidation of people around this. And then one bright day, the President of the United States, after a January meeting on this subject, decided he liked it. And so a few weeks later, he made a speech proposing it to the Soviet Union. What he proposed was a speech designed by some people who've been working with me and meant exactly what he meant at the time, which is my intention. So when it comes to the intention of SDI, come to me. I'll tell you what it was. And I'll give you the case of, swallow the case of my dear old enemy, Teller, and what he said at Eritrea and so forth. And we won people over who had been on that kick because they were intelligent enough to recognize we were right. And this was the right way to go. Not to go to a nuclear war, but to take these weapons and turn them from weapons into building blocks and get the military institutions of the respective countries themselves committed to this policy. Because what you're going to do in warfare is what you can get the military to commit itself to do. So if you change their mind about what their mission orientation is, you change their objectives. And the problem with most military policy is people go in it for war's sake. They don't think of their objective, their cultural objective. That's why we get into foolish wars which build up the power of the British Empire. Because we go killing each other out of some grudge fight when we should be concentrating on how to build mankind. And in every part of society, in every culture, there are people, and people generally of potential influence or influence, who will prefer that. And what you have to do is recruit those people out of their own convictions and tendencies to combine their effort for what they recognize should be their common interest and to dedicate themselves to making it work. And we came damn close up to the point that the day that Reagan made that speech. We had it. And it was only the intention of the British Empire and people who I personally considered traitors to the United States on this issue, who wanted to continue this conflict with the Soviet Union. And it came from Margaret Thatcher's circles in particular. They did not want peace. They did not want war. They did not want the development of mankind. They wanted things like this long war in Afghanistan. They wanted it as a way of getting people to destroy their own nations and themselves. And if people had thought about it, they would realize the mission they were oriented was a war to destroy themselves and to destroy the home from which they had gone to war.